Happy Friday, everybody. So, let me grab this right quick. So this is Derek, the Cowboy Criminologist. As promised, we're going to talk about vampires. I know if you've been to my website, you've been to my Facebook page, you know this has been coming. It's kind of a lot going on in my life personally right now. Getting ready for some big things coming up, and so kind of puts me under the gun to do these videos, but I really hope you're going to enjoy this. If you haven't already, go ahead and like and subscribe to Cowboy Criminology, and we're going to go ahead and get started talking about vampires. So I think the first thing that we need to know is what is your opinion of vampires? Are they well-dressed, well-spoken aristocrats who wear capes and top hats? Do they speak with a heavy accent? Do they sparkle in Washington? What is your opinion of vampires? What do you think of when you think vampires? Well, I'm going to tell you, it really doesn't matter what you think about them, because regardless of how you view vampires, they have your idea has one thing in common, and that's blood drinking. Blood drinking is synonymous with vampires. It's the one trait that every time you hear it in a criminological context, you know somebody drank the blood from somebody else, and it was either part of some kinky ritual, or it was part of some type of paraphilia that they were trying to explore or indulge in. All right. So let me ask you this. If you were to try to pinpoint exactly when vampire mythology came about, when would you say that? Would you think of Bram Stoker's Dracula during the Gothic horror period of the 1800s? Not a bad place to start. If you're a historian, you might say, no. Bram Stoker's Dracula was influenced by Vlad Tepes, a Romanian prince. We'll talk about him a little bit more in the next video. And that's not a bad place to start either. There's a lot of crossover between folklore, mythology, but I think the historical context of Vlad Tepes is often ignored. There's a movie called The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, and it stars John Wayne and Jimmy Stewart. Lee Marvin plays Liberty Valance, the bad guy. It's an awesome movie, phenomenal cast. If you have the chance to see it, please do. But there's a comedian named Robert Wool, and Robert Wool talks about the Liberty Valance effect. And he calls it the Liberty Valance effect, and he takes that from the movie, where at the end, when Jimmy Stewart explains that he's not the hero everybody made him out to be, he's not the man who shot Liberty Valance, it was actually John Wayne, the editor of the paper stands up, he tears this paper up, and Jimmy Stewart says, "You're not going to use that." And the newspaper editor looks right at Jimmy Stewart and he says, "This is the West, sir. When the legend becomes fact, print the legend." Ironically enough, journalists still do that today. They just have a way of ignoring the facts for kind of the more juicy tidbits, you know. I think that could be said of a lot of professions, but yeah, I gotta say I think journalists are guilty of it more than anybody else. But they come by it naturally, and we'll talk about journalists in another video. So, building on that, I think the legend of Vlad Tepes grew to such a fever pitch that people just quit paying attention to the facts and the history and became more enamored with what his legend was. You know, he was known as Vlad the Impaler, and a lot of people think of him as this horrible, evil person, when in reality he was a warrior prince fighting off the Ottoman Empire And I honestly have a hard time believing that he was any more evil than anyone else fighting in that period. He might have just been better at it. All right. So we're back now into medieval times talking about vampires. All right. Now I know there's some scholar out there who goes, "Cowboy, I got you," and I say, "I like a challenge. Go for it." Where did the vampire mythology come from? Came from the Greeks and Romans in the form of the myth Ambrogio, and I would say, "Oh my goodness, you are 100% wrong." Ambrogio came around in the 1500s BC, but there is a legend that even supersedes that, somewhere between 35 and 2800 BC. So a minimum of 1300 years before. So while we're talking about vampires, I want you to think of, or I'm probably gonna tell you about vampires in a way you've never really thought about before, and you'll have to bear with me, okay? And I'm gonna kind of explain along the way. We're gonna go back to ancient Egypt. And like I said, we're somewhere between 35 and 2800 BC when this myth was created. Okay. So let me set a scene for you right quick. Look at my notes. There is a lot to go over here, y'all. All right. So let's see if I can make believers out of you. All right. First off, what is a myth? And you might say ancient religion. You might say a way of storytelling, like tall tales, fables, things like that. All right. Well, let me simplify it a little bit more for you. If I told you, or what if we use the definition, mythology is a way to explain the unexplained world around us. Would anybody want to fight me on that? Or does that seem like a pretty solid definition to go off of? Yeah, I think so too. So if mythology is a mechanism to explain the world around us, to explain the unexplainable, now we have to ask the question, all right, why do we have to explain another human drinking the blood of another human? That's an interesting question. So let me set this up for you. So in ancient Egypt, pharaohs were believed to be gods incarnate, and they were to be revered, worshipped, and respected as such. Okay? So pharaohs kind of walked a fine line between being rulers and being worshipped as deities. Now, like most deities, you have to understand that in ancient times, all deities had their attributes and they had their vices. All right? Because they were made to more closely resemble human beings. All right? So that people could understand that nobody's perfect, I guess. So around this time, with the first known carving is around the second dynasty of the pharaoh Sekhmet. Okay. Now, this is what's difficult about this. So what we're doing is we're taking modern criminological terms and theories, and we're bringing it all the way back to ancient times. And we're doing that, and in doing that, we're trying to explain a behavior at the time that was unexplainable. It's not the way we do it today. And we wouldn't do it today because we have a better understanding of medicine, pharmacy, mental health, psychology, we understand those things a lot better than we did at that time. Okay, but let me pose a story to you. So let's say you're in the court of Kesekum, and a peasant comes to you, and he's holding the body of his wife. She's drained of all color. There's not a drop of blood pouring out of her, but there's a huge wound on her neck that's been opened up. And this peasant appeals to you and says, Pharaoh, why is this happening? What is going on? Why has my wife been taken? Why am I being punished? Talk about being put on the spot. Well, you talk about being put on the spot. So Pharaoh kind of sits there and is like, well, you know what? I'm going to turn you over to my priest. And the priest goes, well, we don't know. Maybe she was mauled by an animal. The peasant sent on his way, and nothing really comes of it. But over the next few weeks, this pattern of finding people who have injuries to their neck and who have been bled out and left in fields, left in houses, all of these things start to raise suspicion. Now, keep in mind, if you're a pharaoh, you've got to understand that everything is your responsibility. And you've got a real problem, and if you can't solve it, it could put people in rebellion against you. Not a good look if you're a ruler who is supposed to be divine. All right? That kind of opens you up to a lot of people second-guessing what you're doing. So as Pharaoh, you say, you know what, I'm going to send my guards out. I'm going to send the best guards I have, and they are going to patrol during the night. And while they're patrolling during the night, they're gonna find this creature, and they're gonna bring it to justice. Okay, we'll stop there for a second. Let's suppose. Yeah, no, we're gonna keep going. All right, and we'll stop here in a second. So out on patrol one night, the royal guards are kind of sitting here. You know, this is a wild goose chase. They have geese in Egypt. Kind of birds do they have in Egypt? It doesn't matter. It's a wild goose chase. We're out here for no reason. I'd rather be back at the palace. I'd rather be in my bed. I'd rather be standing outside doing something other than walking around doing nothing. The other guy with him is like, yeah, but it's such a pretty night. You know, we're out here in the fresh air, and oh, isn't this wonderful? Why? Because you always have that one guy who's like super positive about everything. Even when everyone else is upset about the situation, he's all excited about everything, and those guys draw friendly fire. I'm just gonna say it. Now the guards hear a scream, blood-curdling scream that only comes from murder, and the guards immediately run to where the noise came from, where the scream came from. And what they see is a figure that looks like a lion crouched over this poor person. And this lion has them by the throat. But as they get closer to the lion stands up on two legs and looks at them. And this lion has the head of a lioness and the body of a woman. The guards stop and they're like, okay, this is really weird. Like, we live in ancient Egypt, we see a lot of weird stuff, but, even this is weird. So they seize the creature, and this is where we're going to stop. Now, there's a possibility here. What if this creature had just been a lion, and a lion had seized somebody during the night, and based on hunting patterns of lions, an attack at night would be considered rare. And this lion gets by the throat, which most apex predators, when they take down prey, that's where they attack. The neck is the most vulnerable, and then they go for the abdomen. Soft targets, okay? So now they have this lion. Could that explain these people being dead? It is possible that the lion sees the victim, drug them out into one location, and then drug them back later, and that's why there's not the appearance of blood. That is totally reasonable. I don't know a whole lot about lions, and you know what? I probably should have researched that. But I'm gonna go and say that would probably go against what lions do. Okay, so now let's go back and let's say that the guards believed that this is a lion-headed woman. Okay, why would they think of her that way? Do y'all ever watch TikToks or Instagrams or memes or YouTube videos of people who look like they're pets? And you see that one guy, they show his picture, and you're like, if this guy doesn't have a British bulldog, I will die of shock. Because, I mean, he's perfect. He's got the jowls, he's got the underbite. You know, you just know this guy has to have an English bulldog. And then the English bulldog comes up, and you're like, Ryan Reynolds is Deadpool. You get all excited, and you start making all these really snarky comments. You do it. I do too. So, maybe this was a woman who just had feline features. And I'm sure you've seen specifically women who kind of have that feline look to them. They're very sleek, they're very svelte, they have a very graceful way of moving, and they're often described in demeanor as being cat-like. Okay? Is that a possibility that maybe she just had a resemblance, and because of the trauma the guards experienced in what they see, obviously a woman, you know, seizing a victim by the throat, standing up and having blood on her face, that's probably going to change some impressions for you, or leave an impression. And so I caution you, if you're involved in criminal justice, whether you're a correctional officer, peace officer, social worker, if you're involved with criminal justice, I caution you about questioning people after a traumatic event. It's important to get broad scope details, a general overview of what happened, and each sequential time, because you're probably going to want to meet with this person 3 or 4 times, you're going to ask more detailed questions. And here's why. If somebody witnesses something traumatic and it scares them, or it leaves an impact on them, they may not process things. They may not process the finer details of what they're seeing in a way that makes sense. Like seeing a lion-headed woman seize her victim by the throat. That would be a little out there. That would be a little hard to swallow. But at the same time, the brain has a way of trying to protect the body from trauma. And one way it does that is it tries to interpret information in a way that protects the body. And sometimes that doesn't always make sense. And so when you're going and you're questioning people who have been victims of some kind of traumatic thing, whether it's rape, attempted murder, violent assault, something like that, you've got to understand they're not processing things 100% correctly. Even with the human mind, we like to think that our mind plays back like a video clip, and that's not accurate, because the brain the brain perceives movement, but it doesn't actually see movement. What you're seeing is a bunch of different snapshots just going by really, really fast, and so you perceive movement. All right, that's why hitting a moving target takes a lot of practice. So, when you're looking at trauma, you've got to understand that people might not be putting the information back together in a linear function. Like they may say something happened, 3 minutes ahead of where it did, instead of 3 minutes after. And that's not a lie, that's not an omission, it's just the way the human mind works. So you've got to be very careful about that. But it is possible in this case that the guards in question saw something they couldn't explain, and their brains interpreted it as her having the head of a lioness and the body of a woman. Okay? Could also be that the main guard said he saw something, and his partner went along with it. I didn't see it, but I know him. I know he wouldn't lie. I know he's a good guy. I know he knows his stuff. So if he says he saw that, I'm 100% going to believe him. All right, that's perfectly reasonable. You know, a lot of times in criminal justice, when you're working on the right side of the law, a lot of times you have to go on the character of the people you know, and there comes a time when you have to put a stop to that halo effect. But in a situation like that, yeah, you might as well. So they seize this lion-headed woman, and they bring her back to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh's standing there with the priest, and the Pharaoh's like, looks at the priest and is like, well, are you going to do something about this? The priest is like, aren't you supposed to be divine? So you got a little snipping contest, like, you know, you've got somebody who's supposed to be a god, and you have somebody who's supposed to interpret the god, what the gods are doing. It really creates conflict. So both of these guys are having to tread very carefully, so one can still uphold the image of divinity, and one can still uphold the appearance of subservience to divinity, while still being an expert in divinity. Very, very tricky waters to navigate. I don't envy the priest in this. So the priest decides, I'm going to question this person, but you look familiar. So I said that, you know what, we'll keep going. So the priest goes, who are you? And she says, I am Sekhmet, I am the destroyer, I am the punisher of man. Interesting introduction. Not the worst first impression I think I've ever seen on a date, but yeah, pretty close. I've had some that have gone slightly better and some that have gone slightly worse. But anyway, interesting introduction. Priest goes, where'd you come from? My father Ra has sent me to punish those who displease him. Okay. This is interesting. Now the priest looks at Pharaoh, because, you know, he's supposed to be divine, and says, hey, did you know anything about this? And Pharaoh's like, it really didn't come up in the last meeting. I knew Ra had a daughter. I didn't know much more about her than that. Now this is interesting, because you have to think that this couldn't just be some random woman. I mean, it's possible it could. Anything's possible. You know, you learn that in the police academy. You never say with 100% certainty that something couldn't happen if there's even the most remote chance that it's possible. Defense attorneys love that. But I think it's more likely that this was somebody who found favor with Pharaoh. It could have been a well-liked, well-thought-of servant, a concubine, a wife, somebody who was, I don't want to say really revered, but was in close proximity and favored, I guess is a better way to say it. So this person is favored by Pharaoh. And Pharaoh's like, wow, I didn't know you were divine. And when she explains why she goes out and does what she does, she's saying that she's going out and punishing people because her father Ra is displeased. Ancient times, that would be very hard to argue with. Today, we might think that person is suffering from some type of mental illness like schizophrenia. Like, okay, yeah, your God sent you here to punish mankind. Okay. We're going to skip the do you see or hear people that nobody else can see or hear question, and we're going to go straight to you want to go talk to a friend of mine? Hop in the car. But they needed a way to explain the behavior. And so she's already identified herself. She's already identified herself as a deity. Now the priest has a very difficult decision to make. Does he uphold this idea of divinity in this woman, or does he go against Pharaoh? Now there's a conflict there. The Pharaoh and the priest cannot contradict each other, but ironically enough, they both have to yield to each other because, like I said, the Pharaoh's supposed to be a god in human form, and the priest is supposed to be subservient to the gods. So he's walking a fine line. They both are, because if you question one or the other, and their interpretations are not in alignment, that causes a big problem. Okay. So because of who this person is, because this person is favored by Pharaoh, either the Pharaoh or the priest decided that this person is who they say they are and needs to be worshipped accordingly as a goddess. Problem is, she doesn't have the lion face anymore. But they overhear the guards saying, when we picked her up, she had the face of a lion and she had the body of a woman. So this guard, who may have experienced trauma, is interpreting things one way, which is now affecting, not infecting. I guess it could be an infection. This information is an infection. Anyway, the guard's interpretation of events affects how the priest and Pharaoh see everything. Okay, so now the priest and the Pharaoh are like, okay, well, if she's doing this to punish God, maybe Ra truly is upset with humanity. Maybe he really is punishing us, and maybe we need to gather the people and let them know, y'all really need to step it up because Ra is angry with y'all for whatever you did. So atone, sacrifice, do whatever you have to do, but the killings are going to continue until morale improves, kind of a thing. So now this person has found favor, because think about it like this. You have Sekhmet, the Punisher, the Destroyer, and she is sitting there. She is the daughter of Ra, alright? And Ra being the sun god, he's all-powerful. And so during the night, he goes to sleep, but he leaves the moon, and he leaves his daughter keeping watch over everything. That's pretty intense stuff to think about. Alright, so now we have an idea of where the vampire myth came from. Alright, so what do we have? Only comes out at night, drinks blood, and shapeshift. Alright, those are three common elements in vampire lore. And that's where they started. Okay, so now let's think about it like this. Criminology, or criminal analysis, I guess is the best term for it, comes down to just a few factors. Now they can be combined. There can be one. They can be combined. It doesn't really matter. The point of the matter is something happens that makes somebody embark on this type of behavior. Okay, so let's look at the first one. Let's look at medical causes for vampirism. There is a condition called Porphyria. It is literally known as vampire's disease. And if you think about a vampire, and I'm going to show a picture here in just a second. If you think about a vampire, they have certain characteristics. The skin's drawn back. The gums are receded. The teeth are coming to a point. The ears might be a little pointy. The cuticle nails start to recede. And the nails get long. The sun burns them. The sun burns them very bad. They have an intense aversion to sunlight. They don't like looking at their reflection in the mirror because, when you look like a life model of a Dorian Gray picture, you're probably not going to want to look at yourself in the mirror. The next thing is they have an aversion to sulfur. Okay? What has sulfur in it? Garlic, wine. If you don't believe me about garlic, if you've ever had fresh garlic and you cut it open, take a sniff if you dare, and then light a match. And the smells are very, very close. The sulfur in the match is obviously much more concentrated, but it's not the garlic per se that the vampire is afraid of. It's that they have an intense reaction to sulfur, and it comes from the iron deficiency in the blood, and yeah. So when you have that iron deficiency, one of the treatments for porphyria was drinking blood, and that usually came in the form of drinking the blood of a slaughtered animal, or catching an animal and drinking its blood. But it was never human. But when you think about it, it's got a very animalistic type of vibe to it. Like a human wouldn't do that. Only an animal would do that. Only something supernatural, only something evil would feed on another creature like that. Okay? The point is that the fresh blood has the iron content that they need to elevate their iron levels. So there's some other factors in there, but they're more kind of cause and effect, like being afraid of religious symbols. Well, when you look like everybody's worst nightmare, yeah, there's a good chance that you're probably going to fear religious objects, because those people are going to think of you as evil, and yeah, you're probably going to avoid them at all costs. You're probably going to be an outcast. I'm going to go ahead and dismiss Porphyria in ancient Egypt, because Porphyria is most likely to affect people who are very light pigmented, and so ancient Egypt, that probably wasn't a thing. Now, medical oddities come along all the time. So is it possible that Sekhmet could have had porphyria? It's possible, but unlikely. Okay? So when you're doing a criminal investigative analysis, which is exactly what we're doing, all right, you might be more familiar with it as profiling. Okay? John Douglas, Robert Ressler, Roy Hazelwood, when they would be constructing these profiles, doing these criminal investigative analysis, they would be putting together different aspects of the case based on what is known. And that's exactly what we're doing. We're taking what we know today, we're applying it to what happened some time ago. The catch is, when you're doing a profile, you've got to leave room for it to grow and change based on the information you have. If you have somebody who puts together a profile and they say it's 100% complete, this is the point you're looking for, this is what we're dealing with, this is what we've got, now, I guarantee you it's going to be wrong. I have profiled several cases over 25 years, and I have never had a profile that was 100% accurate at the jump. There was always some piece of information I needed to make it more complete, and even then, I'd still only assign about 95% accuracy, because there are certain things that I just couldn't account for, but my profile was still accurate. And we'll get into some of those in another video. But the point is you've got to leave room for the profile to grow, profile to adapt. A lot of people like John Douglas and Roy Hazelwood and Robert Ressler would consider a profile to be a living, breathing thing. And it's fed by information, and the more information you have, the more complete it is, the more accurate picture you're going to get. All right? So we looked at a medical reason for it, and we dismissed porphyria. All right? Another medical condition, let's say this person was a wife, a concubine, or a servant. Is it possible that this individual could have contracted a sexually transmitted disease? It's possible. And there are certain STDs that if they're not treated, they can manifest themselves in mental health ways that fall into the the schizophrenic episode or schizophrenic disorder criteria. Syphilis and herpes top that list. When they're not treated, they can cause people to behave in different ways. That's a definite possibility. Now, why would it affect her like that, and it didn't affect Pharaoh or anybody else? It could be that because of the Pharaoh's diet, because of his cleanliness, because of the way he's catered to, maybe it slowed the advance of the disease where it wasn't affecting him to that point. Another option, and one that's a little scarier, is what if this person had developed a psychological disorder? Something that made her want to drink blood. Something that made this a craving for her. And now she's got this mental illness brought on by a medical condition that is compelling her to act in a certain way. All right. Now that's really intense right there. And it's kind of scary to think about, but at the same time, it makes sense. So let me break that down just a little further. All right, so everybody's got their little kinks, fetishes, whatever. Those are all paraphilias. Paraphilia means abnormal love. And they are not, paraphilias, a lot of people attribute them to delinquency, deviancy, perversion, things like that, because the father of paraphilias, Dr. Richard von Krafft-Ebing, wrote the book Psychopathia Sexualis. All right, Psychopathia Sexualis. That's not really setting things up as, just light summer reading, okay? By the way, very interesting book. But he started diagnosing people who are severely mentally ill or criminally insane. Those were the standards back then when he wrote the book. And so that's how people came to know about paraphilias. All right, paraphilias in themselves are not harmful. All right, when they're between two consenting people, age-appropriate relationship, all of those things, it's not. It's something to enhance, sexual pleasure, what have you. It's not bad in and of itself. When people think paraphilias, they get to thinking of paraphilic disorder. Paraphilic disorder is something completely different. Paraphilia, or paraphilic disorder, is when you have a paraphilia that you've taken to a whole new level. Like you are so fixated on this object, this act, this whatever it is, you are so fixated on it that you have to have it. You have to have it in that instant. And it becomes a problem because a lot of times that paraphilic disorder takes over and it manifests itself in a criminal way. Like when you apply that paraphilia to a non-consenting partner. Now, not only do you have a paraphilic disorder, you have a criminal act. All right? But what on earth would cause somebody to drink blood? If it's not porphyria, and it's not a mental illness caused by some type of infection. So there's a paraphilia called hematolagnia. And hematolagnia is arousal by blood. It doesn't matter where it comes from. It doesn't matter the source. It doesn't matter if you see it, touch it, smell it, taste it, you just have a desire for blood in whatever aspect. Like I said, everybody's got their things. Maybe your kink involves maple syrup and a bug zapper. I don't know. I hope we're never close enough that I have that information about you. But you know what? You enjoy yourself. I don't know what you're doing with the bug zapper or the maple syrup. But with hematolagnia, this desire becomes very intense. And when we talk about werewolves coming up, we're going to hear about a guy who lived close to a butcher. And he said it was the smell of blood that just, he could not get enough of it. And so much so that he got work in the butcher shop and then was subsequently fired because he was he was accused of stealing the meat. He wasn't stealing the meat. He was eating the meat raw because he was getting all of that. He was getting his fix of blood, and he was also caught going out and slaughtering animals that weren't ready to be slaughtered. And there's a whole thing on that. Is it possible that Sekhmet could have come to this paraphilia in a certain way? Maybe she was having sexual thoughts or fantasies, saw an animal being butchered, and it just imprinted on her in a certain way. Did she see a lioness attack some kind of animal, or maybe even a person? And there was something about that imprinted on her sexually. And the more and more she thought about it, the more she was like, I'm going to do that. Because here's how these things start, all right? You've got a thought. And that thought comes and goes, but it kind of lingers on, and then you start kind of exploring that thought, and that becomes a fantasy. So you think about that fantasy, and you start thinking about it over and over and over and over and over again, and it starts to become a part of you. It starts to become something that drives you beyond anything else you've ever experienced. And now you start to be compelled by that fantasy. And the fantasy becomes so intense that people actually have physical manifestations. Like they'll start to shake, they'll become very anxious, they may become moody because they can't live this out. We'll talk about that more when we talk about other serial killers. You're going to discover this vampire video sets the stage and the theme for a lot of things that we've got coming up. All right, so hang with me, okay? So, what if this person's hematolagnia had developed to such an extent that they decided they were going to carry it out on another person? They were able to sneak out. They were able to find people who are vulnerable, and whatever the cause, whether it was medically induced or psychologically induced, they decided to act on this particular paraphilic disorder. All right. Just so you know, I'm probably going to shorten paraphilic disorder to paraphilia just for the sake of brevity. But when I'm talking about paraphilia in criminological context, I will tell you that we're talking about it in terms of criminality and not in terms of what you do behind closed doors with consenting partners. That's completely up to you. There is a difference. Just know, in criminological terms, when I say paraphilia, I mean paraphilic disorders, and I will specify when I'm just talking about a run-of-the-mill paraphilia, okay? All right, so now we've got hematolagnia. We've talked about that, okay? So now we've got a medical and a psychological. What about pharmacological? There are certain substances, amphetamine, cocaine. There's even a plant that grows pretty much worldwide. And I didn't look to see if a variety of it grows in Egypt. I'm pretty sure it does. It would be similar to cotton, but it comes from the nightshade. Sorry about that. Hazards of recording on your phone. So part of the nightshade family has something that's similar to amphetamine. and that could give somebody this appearance, this idea of grandiosity. They're faster, stronger, all of these different things, and maybe it emboldens them to act on these fantasies. We don't really know, but it's possible. And if you've ever seen somebody on a high from an amphetamine, you know that they're not really in their right state of mind. You also know that they could have a lot of fight to them. They appear to have superhuman strength. And what I remember hearing most common when I was a police officer is he wouldn't have done that if it weren't for the drugs or it weren't for the alcohol. He wouldn't act like that without these. He wouldn't have done that if it weren't for. Okay, and that might be to a point, but the fact is that they're still acting out on it, and they've probably thought about acting out on it. Only now they don't have any inhibitions, and now they've got a built-in excuse. They're taking the substance, and no, that wasn't me. It was, it's. I bartended for a couple of years in Vegas, and I can tell you this: alcohol can do what those sodium pentothal and stuff like that claim to do. You want an honest answer from somebody? Talk to them when they're intoxicated, because they will not hold back. And some people are cruel when they're drunk, and some people are hilarious. And some people are somewhere in between. But honesty seems to be the thing that they all have in common. So what if there was some substance that she took? So this is a pharmacological cause. And when we get more into werewolves, we'll talk more about folk medicine, folk remedies, stuff like that, because they do go hand in hand. And when people may have been trying to help, maybe there was a doctor, a physician, something in Pharaoh's court that was trying to help this person, but what it was doing was aggravating a mental illness or a medical condition or something like that caused them to act out in a very specific way. All right. So when you think about that, when you think about a monster in criminological terms, you can look for reasons that are medical, psychological, pharmacological. Yeah. So you got those three. Or I'm sorry, there's a fourth, criminological. Of course, this is Cowboy Criminology. Why wouldn't criminal come up? Criminal is different. Sometimes people just have that criminal compulsion to act out their darkest desires. And while I would agree that borderline personality disorder is certainly a mental illness, it's not an excuse to go out and snatch somebody by the throat with your teeth and drink their blood. It doesn't really work that way. Matter of fact, courts have been pretty consistent about saying, that's not an excuse. More serial killers would be alive if it were, but it's not, and thank God for that. So and a lot of you might think, okay, criminological. Why is that different than psychological or medical or pharmacological? The simple thing is this: when I was taking my lower level criminal justice classes, my instructors seemed to be fixated on this idea that there is one unifying theory of criminal justice that sums up everything about criminality. And the truth is, there is one, and we'll get to that in another video. And it's based on risk versus reward, and we'll talk about that. We'll talk about that a little more later, or in a later video. But on itself, it still doesn't really get to the heart of why people choose to do things. When you're talking about a criminological explanation for vampirism, you're going to look at what's going on in this person's life, how were they raised, how were they treated, how did they adapt socially. You're going to look at all these different things that come together to try and figure out some explanation for why they chose to engage in the behavior that they chose to engage in. Those kind of questions are going to probably take you to places you're not really going to like. Some interviews that I've seen with serial killers have been very, very intense, and you listen to them talk and you're like, wow, you had absolutely no shot. But you have some of those people who engage in criminal activity who don't have those backgrounds. They don't have any type of substance abuse. They don't have any type of medical condition or mental illness that would explain why all of a sudden one day they decided to go off and commit these horrible acts. All right. They can fall into it. They can be influenced in that. And when we talk about serial killer couples coming up in a few videos, we're going to kind of go into that just a little bit more. But the fact remains is that people from a criminological explanation of vampirism, they're engaging in it because they want to. It fulfills a fantasy. It fulfills an identity, an ideology of who they are or how they want to be seen, and that can be very scary. That's very frightening, because there's nothing there to blame that on. What we're seeing is the manifestation of what we would consider just pure evil. Now, I'll tell you, as a kid, my brother, a huge fan of vampires, just thought vampires are just the coolest things ever, coolest monster. And I've always considered vampires to be kind of what's a good word? Let's go back to the 1800s. They were very dandyish. They were very foppish. And I never really thought of vampires as being hyper masculine. I've always saw vampires as very effeminate, and it's kind of interesting that the first vampire was a female. So, which does kind of give logic and reasoning to a lot of movies where the head vampire, the lead vampire, the whatever is a female. So it's very interesting that that the research kind of supports that ideal. My sister and I, we were more into the slashers. We didn't really do the monsters. The monsters were just kind of like, the effects are cool, but whatever. But our favorite slasher was Michael Myers. And the first two movies, the originals with Jamie Lee Curtis, the original two movies from the late 70s and early 80s, what I liked about that is Michael Myers outwardly had no reason to commit the crimes he did. But one day he just decided to snap and begin killing people. And what I dislike is in later iterations, they always gave him something. He was part of a cult. The Rob Zombie movies, excuse me, he was abused and neglected and doted on by the mother. And I'm like, oh my goodness, are we setting up a Ted Bundy or what? All right, Ted Bundy with a vow of celibacy and a vow of silence. All right, that's not my favorite in the canon. But the idea that somebody would just one day just become evil, would one day just decide that they were going to embark on this criminal journey where they're going to hurt as many people as they can, that's terrifying. All right? That's evil. And the thing about the first two movies is there's not really an explanation for why. You just know that he is. And to me, that's the scariest thing That's the scariest thing about Michael Myers, or was. You didn't know. You didn't know why. There was no reason. There was no logic. There was no nothing. There was nothing in his background that would cause that. From a criminological standpoint, when somebody engages in horrific criminal activity and there's nothing in their background to explain why all of a sudden they decided to go down that path, that's when you're dealing with a monster. And when you're dealing with a monster like that, and the only way you can explain it is somebody being evil. And now you have to attribute that to some supernatural source, especially if you don't understand it. But when you do understand it, you come to realize that from a criminological perspective, all was not right with young Michael when he was 6 years old. There was a fantasy, there was a thought that turned into a fantasy. That fantasy became a fixation, and one night he decided to act on it. All right? That's how you bring a monster to life. And that's how the legend of the vampire came to be. Somebody needed to explain something evil while at the same time uplifting, exalting, and man, my vocabulary is just gone today. And reaffirming the pharaoh's role as a god incarnate over Egypt. So y'all, I hope you enjoyed that. I'm going to try and get the next vampire video up next weekend. These do take a little while to post, so I'm hoping to have this up by tonight. It's Friday the 26th, 25th, 26th, somewhere around there. It's January, late January, and I'll have this up as soon as I can. Y'all, thank you so much for spending time with me. Please like or subscribe. Be sure to share this website or this video with your fellow crime fighting true crime junkies. Y'all stay safe, and we'll see you next week.